14 words from a marine assistance call created one of the biggest problems in Nolan Wells's case. 7 passengers were counted, but Nolan was never named. The call fixed a time, a rough location, and an emergency in the record. It did not establish whether the 18-year-old was still with his friends when their boat left Horn Island. That gap is real. That missing answer sits at the center of everything that followed, because Nolan was found dead on the island 2 days later, and by mid-August 2026, no public medical finding had explained how he died. I want to keep one question in view from the start. What can the evidence actually carry, and where does certainty outrun it? That matters because this case has produced 2 very different kinds of pressure at once. Nolan's family has spent weeks asking why their son died and why the official findings remain sealed. At the same time, people who have not been charged in connection with his death have been labeled killers online, threatened, and pushed into defamation fights. Both realities exist together. The challenge is not choosing which one feels more urgent. It is separating what is established from what remains disputed before the next viral claim hardens into a verdict. That separation has been difficult almost from the beginning. The case moved quickly from a local death investigation into a national argument. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump joined Nolan's family. Members of Congress pressed for more scrutiny. Reverend Al Sharpton later addressed the case publicly and put up a $50,000 reward for credible information. Then the internet supplied its own layer: allegations of deleted posts, claims about enhanced audio, accusations against specific young men, and fabricated documents serious enough to prompt a state warning. The attention increased the pressure for answers. It also made every unverified detail more dangerous, because a claim did not need to be proven before it could reach millions of people. One example shows how quickly that can happen. Early confusion about Nolan's swim trunks became a talking point. Some people treated the color discrepancy as evidence that his friends were lying, yet the confusion was corrected with a photograph taken earlier that day, and when Nolan's body was recovered, he was still wearing blue trunks. That point was settled. That does not prove every account given by his friends was accurate. It proves only that this particular discrepancy had a mundane resolution. A detail can look suspicious before the full context arrives. That is exactly why I am going to keep returning to the same standard. What does a fact establish, and what does it leave untouched? The same problem surfaced with claims that social media content had been deleted. Some online accounts treated the absence of posts as evidence of deliberate erasure. Friends said many people on the island simply were not using their phones much, partly because reception was unreliable. From outside the devices, neither claim settles the issue. The devices matter. The only clean way to answer it is forensic examination, not screenshots passed from account to account. As of the period covered here, Nolan's own phone had reportedly not been fully examined. That means the digital record was still an open lane, not proof of concealment, and not proof that nothing had been removed. If you were weighing this case with only the public record, which matters more to you here, what people remember posting, or what the devices can eventually show, then came the audio claims. Unverified clips circulated with listeners saying they could hear background words such as Nolan's name or a command to wake up. Some people treated those interpretations as a breakthrough. They were never authenticated by a named audio forensics expert connected to the investigation, and the friends involved denied the interpretation. Repetition did not turn the clip into stronger evidence. It only made the claim more familiar. The same happened with fake documents that circulated as supposed investigative records. By early August, officials were warning the public that fabricated material was moving through the case. That warning did not tell anyone how Nolan died. It told everyone something else. The information environment had become contaminated, and the contamination had consequences. Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, faced an anonymous professional misconduct complaint before the Mississippi Board of Nursing. Crump later said the complaint had been closed as unfounded. No public evidence identified who filed it or why. On the other side of the case, people associated with Nolan's friend group received threats, and criminal charges followed. In one instance, Edward James Porter was accused of threatening witnesses and their families. In another, The relatives of a young man connected to the case received threatening messages. Michelle Francine Edwards became the third defendant, charged in connection with a bomb threat aimed at a county government office. The underlying death remained unresolved, but the fallout around it was already producing criminal cases of its own. That is also how Bart Edmiston Jr. became a central name in the public argument. He was 21, had played football with Nolan, and was among the wider group on Horn Island. No law enforcement agency had publicly named him as a suspect. No criminal charge connected him to Nolan's death. Yet posts online attached his name to words like suspect and killer. His attorney, Russ Latino, said the backlash left people around Edmiston fearing for their safety. The family's public position was categorical. Edmiston did not kill Nolan and did not contribute to his death. They said he cooperated with investigators, gave access to his boat, phone, and GPS information, and provided witness names. That is their account. It isn't a legal finding, but neither are the accusations aimed at him. The response moved toward litigation. Edmiston's legal team sent cease and desist letters and announced defamation action. Other attorneys representing young men from the group also said they intended to pursue people they believed were spreading false accusations. A college student who had also been on Horn Island separately sued online personalities, accusing them of defaming him and encouraging threats. The timing stands out. These cases began before anyone was charged with causing Nolan's death. That sequence should bother anyone who cares about both justice and accuracy. A public investigation had raced far enough ahead of the official one to create its own defendants, its own investigators, and its own legal battles, while the central medical question was still unanswered. That scale is one reason the case became so difficult to discuss calmly. By mid-August, it had reached national outlets, high-profile attorneys, civil rights leaders, lawmakers, local officials, private investigators, forensic specialists, and thousands of online commentators. The number of voices created an illusion of resolution. There were so many people talking that it could feel as though the facts must be complete. They were not. The state's autopsy was finished but sealed. The family's independent examination was still incomplete in important ways. The last hour of Nolan's known movements contained a material gap, and no one had been publicly charged with causing his death. The louder the case became, the more important those absences became. Before any of that noise, there was Nolan himself. Nolan Xavier Wells was an 18-year-old from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. He'd recently finished high school. He played football, and people close to him described the sport as a major part of his life. He was at the age when summer still feels like an extension of school life and adulthood is only beginning to arrive. Reporting connected him with plans to continue football at the junior college level. He was just starting. His family described a young man moving into the next phase of his life, not someone whose name would soon be reduced to arguments about autopsies, GPS tracks, and boat mechanics. Ocean Springs matters here because it was not an anonymous place to the people involved. It is a small city on the Gulf Coast where several accounts describe Nolan's circle and their families as knowing one another for years. The friendships were long-standing. The friends who spent July 4th with him rejected the idea that he was a stranger or a casual acquaintance. They described long-standing relationships, time spent in one another's homes, parents who knew the kids, and friendships formed through school and football. That does not rule out negligence, conflict, accident, or harm. Close relationships do not make bad outcomes impossible. But portraying the group as unknown people who barely knew Nolan adds a motive-shaped suggestion the public record does not support. His mother would later speak publicly about the ordinary things she had lost, calling her son, hugging him, sharing time with him in person. Nolan would have turned 19 on August 19th. His family and attorneys planned a day of prayer for that date, with a separate vigil arranged in Biloxi. Those details matter because the case has a tendency to become an argument about institutions and theories. The birthday strips abstraction away. He was not supposed to be a symbol. He should have been 19. The emotional weight around his family also explains why the early official language landed so badly. After Nolan's body was recovered, local authorities said there were no obvious signs of foul play. To some listeners, that sounded like a conclusion before the investigation had really begun. But the phrase described an early field assessment, not a completed forensic determination. It came before the full state autopsy and before the family's independent examination. That distinction matters. Later findings of an undetermined cause and manner did not automatically prove that the first statement was false. They answered a different question at a different stage. That distinction may be unsatisfying, but it is essential. Still, the family's refusal to accept an easy explanation was also grounded in something real. They did not have a cause of death. They hired their own forensic pathologist and pushed for more information. Crump became the most visible attorney speaking for them, and the case grew beyond Mississippi. Civil rights leaders connected the family's distrust to the state's history. Pressure followed. Members of Congress asked for federal oversight. Their argument was not that history itself proved what happened on Horn Island. It was that a death this unclear, in this place, justified intense scrutiny and outside attention. For a family waiting without a medical answer, that pressure was a tool. The historical comparison became one of the most combustible parts of the case. Emmett Till's name appeared in commentary, and Sharpton invoked Till and Medgar Evers when speaking about Nolan. For many Black Americans, the location mattered because Mississippi's record of racial violence is not theoretical. It includes Till's 1955 murder, the assassination of Evers, and the 1964 murders of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. That history explains distrust. It does not establish the cause of Nolan's death. A comparison can explain why people demand scrutiny without proving that the present case is a repetition of the past. That distinction cuts both ways. Some local voices argued that national coverage had turned Ocean Springs into a symbol the community did not recognize. They described black and white teenagers attending school together, socializing together, and moving through one another's families in ways that did not match the image of a town frozen in an earlier era. Other voices answered that social familiarity has never guaranteed the absence of racial bias or violence. Both points are relevant. Neither tells us what happened to Nolan on July 4. A community can feel unfairly portrayed and still deserve scrutiny. A family can invoke history without history becoming forensic evidence. If this case has an emotional low point, it is that Nolan's mother has had to fight for answers while watching strangers build certainty around facts she herself has not been given. No public cause of death, no completed public toxicology, no settled account of the last moments before the boat left. A birthday arrived without him. If you want the next verified development, rather than the next rumor, subscribe for the update that actually changes the evidence. The day itself began as a holiday trip. Nolan went to Horn Island on July 4, 2026 with friends. Horn Island lies off the Mississippi Gulf Coast and draws boaters on summer weekends, especially on a holiday. It was crowded. Accounts from people there described a large crowd around the northwest portion of the island, with dozens of boats and hundreds of people moving through the area. Nolan's group was one cluster inside that larger crowd. That matters because a packed shoreline can create witnesses, but it can also create confusion. People move between boats, plans change, phones fail, and later reconstruction becomes difficult. At some point that afternoon, Nolan and the group stopped being together. That moment is the first major fracture in the timeline. The friend's account says they were preparing to leave and that a boat operator named Wyatt called for Nolan to get aboard. They said Nolan wanted to remain with a young woman, Katie McCormack, and had another ride arranged. A different recollection entered later through Katie's sister, Gracie McCormack. She relayed Katie's belief that Nolan was moving to board the departing boat and that his friends would not have intentionally left him there. The conflict is direct. Those versions cannot both describe the moment accurately. The case turns on which one is closer to what actually happened. No public timestamped video has settled it. No location record tied directly to Nolan has resolved the exact separation. A private analytical review commissioned in the case later described a material gap between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the departure of the boat carrying his friends. The report assigned no responsibility. It never declared foul play. It identified the point where the record stops being complete. That is a powerful finding precisely because it is limited. It tells investigators where the story breaks. It doesn't tell them why. The boat trouble began soon after departure, according to the friends. They said a bilge pump failed, water rose inside the hull, and the boat's electronics were affected. The group described running the boat in a way intended to help drain water while also seeking marine assistance. A call was placed at roughly 4 p.m. The caller reported a boat taking on water, said about 7 people were aboard, said none were older than 21, and confirmed life jackets were available. The caller declined an offer to involve the Coast Guard. The call is real. That call is one of the few timed records in the day, which is why every word around it has been pulled apart. But the call has a hard limit. It never says Nolan's name. It does not identify all 7 passengers. It does not establish whether Nolan had already separated from the boat or whether the separation happened later. GPS information cited in reporting placed the boat leaving the island at about 4:31 p.m. A tow carried it for about 2¾ miles before the boat recovered enough power to proceed on its own. Reporting later put its speed as high as 34 knots, with dock arrival near 5:44 p.m. Those numbers sharpen the timeline. They do not fill the missing space inside it. The boat story also created a second contradiction. Friends described serious flooding and electrical trouble, while publicly circulated images of the tow did not appear to show the kind of dramatic flooding some viewers expected. That mismatch raised questions about how severe the problem was and how quickly it was corrected. The Friends' explanation involved a real boating technique that can help clear accumulated water while a vessel is moving. The visual record, however, did not give outside observers a simple confirmation of every detail that makes the boat problem worth examining. It does not make it proof of a killing. The gap between those two statements is where much of the online argument went off the rails. Cell service added another complication. Reception was uneven. Members of the group described reception around Horn Island as inconsistent, with calls and uploads failing at different points. One friend said attempts to reach his mother did not go through until the boat was closer to shore, yet the marine assistance call connected and included detailed information about the boat's condition and location. That is worth noticing. It is not impossible. Spotty service can produce exactly that pattern. Failure, then connection, then failure again. The evidence creates a question about communication, not a verdict about deception. Back on the mainland, Nolan's family had a different problem. By evening, they could not reach him. The concern was immediate. Their concern escalated into a confrontation at the home of one of his friends. According to the friend who described the encounter, roughly 10 to 15 people arrived in several vehicles and pressed for Nolan's location, the boat, and the boat owner's address. During that visit, Nolan's phone, which friends said he had left on the boat, was handed over. Some members of the group then went to inspect the boat itself. Later that night, Nolan's father or stepfather came back seeking the boat keys. The friend said he found them on an Xbox console and handed them over almost immediately. Police were eventually called to the house around 2 a.m., and officers reportedly told the visitors to leave. The friends have maintained that the phone and keys were given up without a prolonged fight. That account matters because online versions sometimes portrayed the exchange as far more dramatic. The family's urgency makes sense. Nolan was missing, his phone was elsewhere, and the people who had gone to the island with him had come back without him. From that point forward, every hour increased the stakes. For roughly the next day and a half, Nolan's whereabouts were unknown. Search efforts expanded across the waters and shoreline around Horn Island. Local authorities became involved. Volunteer rescuers, including United Cajun Navy, joined the effort. Family and friends kept looking. On July 6, the search changed completely. A U.S. park ranger located a body on the island's northwestern shoreline. It was Nolan. The search ended there. The forensic questions began there. On July 10th, 4 days after the recovery, Dr. Roger Mitchell conducted the family's independent autopsy. Mitchell is a board-certified pathologist. Preliminary findings were announced on July 22. The result was limited. The preliminary result left both cause and manner undetermined, while additional investigation continued. Crump said Mitchell was unable to exclude foul play. The examination recorded red discoloration at the back of Nolan's head, but no public conclusion identified what produced it or linked it to a particular injury mechanism. That is the strongest accurate version of the medical information. The independent examination did not establish homicide, and it did not establish an accidental drowning. It was incomplete in other ways too. Crump said the independent examination lacked toxicology and that certain body parts or tissues were unavailable during the procedure. By early August, Mitchell was reportedly seeking additional throat tissue for further study. The absence of that material does not prove a particular cause of death. It shows why the preliminary findings stayed preliminary. A pathologist asking for more tissue is saying the existing record does not answer every question. That is not a hidden homicide ruling. It is unfinished forensic work. The official state autopsy followed a separate path. By July 31st, it was reported complete, but the results were not released publicly. District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath said Jackson County's practice was to send qualifying death cases to a grand jury before evidence such as autopsy findings became public. She described that as standard county procedure rather than a special rule created for Nolan's case. Critics, including civil rights advocates and members of Congress, pushed for more openness and outside scrutiny. The institutional dispute is real, but it should not be confused with the medical one. Secrecy can be frustrating without proving misconduct. A grand jury is important here because it is not a trial. It does not decide guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The threshold is narrower. It reviews evidence presented by prosecutors and decides whether there is enough to support criminal charges. If it returns an indictment, the accused person still retains the presumption of innocence. If it declines to indict, that does not automatically prove every suspicious circumstance was innocent. It means the legal threshold for charges was not met on the evidence presented. That distinction will matter the moment any grand jury decision becomes public, because the internet will almost certainly try to turn it into something broader. 3 lanes remained. The investigation still had 3 major open lanes. First, the witness lane. What exactly happened during Nolan's final hour with the group, and which version of the separation is accurate? Second, the digital lane. What do phones, GPS records, metadata, and any recoverable communications show when examined directly? Third, the medical and environmental lane. What do the sealed state findings, toxicology, tissue analysis, currents, water conditions, and injuries establish about how Nolan died? Until those lanes narrow, every complete theory remains ahead of the record. The accidental drowning theory remains possible because Nolan was on a barrier island surrounded by water, and early officials said they saw no obvious sign of foul play. But that theory still has to account for the independent examination remaining undetermined and for the unresolved timeline. The more complicated accident theory also remains possible: a fall, impairment, medical event, unintended altercation, or other event followed by panic or confusion. That version would depend heavily on toxicology, witness accounts, and physical evidence not yet public. Then comes the foul play theory. It cannot be ruled in from the public record any more than it can be ruled out. It would require medical and investigative evidence connecting a person to a criminal act. None has been publicly established. That is where the case stood by the middle of August 2026. Nolan Wells was 18. He was last known to be on Horn Island on July 4th and was found dead there on July 6. The family's independent pathologist listed cause and manner as undetermined and said foul play could not be excluded. The official autopsy was complete, but sealed. A private review identified a material gap in the timeline. Law enforcement had publicly identified no suspect, and nobody had been criminally charged with causing Nolan's death. 3 people had faced charges tied to threats surrounding the case. Defamation actions were developing, and federal oversight had been requested by members of Congress. Now I can answer the question I asked at the beginning: how much certainty can the evidence carry? Not enough to name anyone, not enough to close the case as a simple drowning either. The public record supports scrutiny. not a verdict. It supports the family's demand for answers. It supports questions about the separation, the boat, the phones, the medical findings, and the pace of disclosure. It also supports a firm line around uncharged people whose names have been turned into accusations without public evidence strong enough to justify them. That is not neutrality for its own sake. It is the only position the known record can sustain. The next major development could change that. A grand jury could receive evidence the public has never seen. The state autopsy could eventually become public. Phone forensics may narrow it. A witness could provide a piece of information that resolves the separation on the island. Any one of those developments could materially alter the case. But until that happens, a confident theory remains a theory, even when it is emotionally satisfying, politically resonant, or repeated by thousands of accounts. There is one practical thing that matters more than another post. If someone has original, unedited video, photographs with intact metadata, or first-hand information from Horn Island on July 4th, that material belongs with investigators and the attorneys working the case before it belongs in a comment thread. Keep the original file intact. Do not crop it, re-record it, or strip away metadata through repeated uploads. Real evidence can lose value when it is processed for social media. A clean original may answer a question that 10,000 interpretations cannot. Then there is Nolan's birthday. August 19 should have been his 19th. It became a day of prayer and remembrance instead. His mother had spent the weeks before it standing in front of cameras, asking for answers about a son she should still have been able to call. That image is where this case should end for now, because it forces the argument back onto the person at the center of it. Nolan Wells is gone. His family is still waiting. The people accused online, without charges, are still living with the consequences of those accusations. And the evidence, not the loudest theory, is what has to close the distance between those facts.